This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Hey guys, I'm here with another video in my Brigitte workbook series, and in this video I'm working on her leg armor. At this point I've already cut out all of the pieces I needed in 6mm EVA foam. That is all this dark gray foam that you're seeing here, and what I'm doing here is putting contact cement along the seam lines and sticking those together to create the entire piece for the front leg armor. So once the base of those leg pieces are together, I start gluing on all the small details, such as the lining around the edges, and to create those I'm using 2mm EVA foam, which is all of the colorful foam you will see in this video. These patterns or templates are available on my store Envy and Etsy if you prefer shopping there. So before I can move on to gluing on some of the other details, I have to go ahead and Dremel some of the edges, which is what I'm doing in this clip. Now I can glue on this back layer, but instead of making an entire bottom layer, I just made an area that's going to go on the part that shows, which is this weird square shape. I'm not really sure what to call this piece, but it's part of her leg armor. This section of it just happens to sit lower or farther back than the rest, and this is how I found was easiest to create that effect. Now I'm taking a box cutter and I'm scoring the foam where she has this carved detail on her armor, because when I hit it with a heat gun, it will open up that line. Just be careful not to cut all the way through. Working on some more pieces to attach to that leg armor, I'm creating the bolts, and the way I did this was cut out a circle shape in 6mm EVA foam, and then I dremeled the sides to be at a slight bevel, and then I took a smaller Dremel head to Dremel in and carve in some of the small details that are on this bolt piece. After that, I apply contact cement to the back of all the bolt pieces and to the area on the leg armor where they're going to attach. Let that dry for just a tiny bit and get a little tacky, and then stick it together. Now I'm gluing in this curved top section of her leg armor. Then I'm taking a Dremel and dremeling these rectangle pieces at an angle. This is the piece that sits on top of her leg armor and under her knee armor, like in between the two. And now that everything is glued together, I prime it with a couple layers of wood glue. After a couple layers of wood glue, I use Bondo's glazing and spot putty to fill in the seams, let that dry, sand it out, and do another couple layers of wood glue. I should mention that I have, before priming obviously, used a Dremel to carve in some more of the smaller details, like those oval shaped circles in the armor and battle damage. But you'll see me do this on other leg armor pieces that we'll be doing later in the video. I used acrylic paint to paint the entire armor pieces. What? I used acrylic paint to paint all of the armor pieces. That sounds right. So here, I'm painting the silver color onto the armor, and it takes quite a few layers before it's fully opaque. Before painting on the yellow colors, I put down a white base. I can't speak, I'm sorry guys. And then I also paint on the black detail at the top of the leg armor here. I top it off with a glossy coat of spray paint, shade it with oil paint, and then use another coat of glossy spray paint. Backtracking a bit, here's some footage from the knee armor process. Here I've taken the bolts and I'm dremeling in some details, and I've already dremeled the edges at a slight bevel. I've also already dremeled the knee armor and used a heat gun to better shape it, so I'm just gluing on the last detail pieces for that. Here I'm taking my Dremel and I'm carving in some battle damage that I've already marked out where I wanted it to go with a marker. I recommend doing that because if you carve it out, it's going to be hard to fill it in later. So just make sure everything's looking right beforehand. And this piece is just this piece that sits and behind the knee armor that you never actually really see. But it was a small detail and I like having all the little details, so I threw it in anyways. And this is all 2mm EVA foam, by the way. And then we go through the same priming and painting process again. I've laid down a white base and then painted yellow on top of it. After a coat of clear glossy spray paint, I started shading the piece with oil paint. So I shade in all of the battle damaged areas and then around anything that would cast a shadow, as well as some areas just to kind of grunge it up and make it look like it might be a little dirty in that area or have smudge marks or scrape marks or something on it. Now here I'm working on the armor that sits at the back of the leg. So I'm taking a Dremel and dremeling the center pieces at a slight bevel or angle so that when I connect the two pieces it will curve just a bit, not necessarily come to a point, but it will help curve it a bit more. And then a heat gun that I'll use later that I don't have footage of will help get it to be the correct shape that I need. Once I've glued the two halves of each piece together, I then go ahead and bevel the edges of the pieces where they're going to connect to each other and then glued those together. So I've glued both halves of each section together at this point, and now I'm gluing the top section to the middle section and then the middle section to the bottom section so that it's all one piece. Once it's glued together, I have to take a Dremel to sand down and even out all of the outside edges to make sure everything's sitting nice and smooth and looks clean. taking a smaller Dremel head, I carve in some of these squared details into the foam or armor piece, and then I add some battle damage to it. And then I go through the priming and painting process again, a few layers of wood glue, then some Bondo's spot putty and gap filler to fill in any of the seams, sand that down, and then another couple layers of wood glue. And then I paint it with acrylic paints, shade it with oil paints, and use clear glossy coats of spray paint in between all those layers and to seal it at the end. And to finish up the leg armor, I'm working on the thigh piece. So for the thigh piece, I've used only 2mm EVA foams because unless you have quite a big thigh gap, anything thicker is going to make it really difficult to walk. And I don't have a thigh gap. So I found 2mm EVA foam works perfectly fine and still keeps me movable without having to waddle like a penguin. So here I've glued the two centers together as you just saw a little bit ago, and now I'm adding the edging that's around, well, the edges. And these edges or edging pieces are 2mm EVA foam, and they're about 1/4 of an inch wide. I didn't bother to measure out the strips for this area at all whatsoever. You can if you want to. Instead, I just kind of winged it as I went along, laying down the strips a little bit at a time and cutting off any excess. And again, I'm using contact cement to glue down all of these pieces. Now I'm taking a marker and I'm marking out areas where I want battle damage to go, and then taking my Dremel and carving those areas out. Be really careful when doing that on this thin of foam because it's really easy to just Dremel all the way through, so I made sure to have a light hand. I also sanded down the edges to smooth that out. I wanted to keep this piece flexible, so I used Plasti Dip as my primer, and then I painted it the same way I've painted all the other pieces. And yes, I'm painting black on black, but it's a slightly lighter shade of black. I added some white highlights with acrylic paint around these battle damage or scratch marks on the black piece, and then shaded the battle damage on the silver piece with black oil paint, and then topped it off with a glossy coat of clear spray paint. And that finishes it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it helpful. Thanks for watching. I'll be back with more Brigitte videos in the future. Have a lovely day. Bye!